Hey, groovy to see you again. I've been away a bit and off seeking new and interesting things to bring you. And so, with my exploring some new and interesting things, I realized what I had to do before I bring you them is to rap with you a little bit about the genres that these things exist within. So I've been having a look at a lot of writers who write what is called speculative fiction. And speculative fiction divides up into various subgenres. And so as a result, it all starts to get pretty messy if I don't start explaining these things to you. So every so often, as we come into a new genre or a new mode of literature, I'm going to give you a little rap about what the genre is before we get into any of the writers, okay? So today we're going to be rapping about science fiction. Yeah, I know that's a really big one that is so huge as a concept. Science fiction, it's a massive genre, huge genre. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Science fiction, in terms of novels, really begins with Mary Shelley, what a groovy chick, and Frankenstein. There are other works that are earlier than Mary Shelley that would be classified as speculative fiction. They're sometimes deemed science fiction, but really they're not. They're more speculative. For instance, Gulliver's Travels is a satire on the novel. It's not really interested in the science and the mechanics of the actual worlds that Gulliver goes to, and therefore I would classify these as speculative fiction, all of these precursors, because Mary Shelley is very interested in science. The fact that the creature is not brought together by some like weird 18th century voodoo, but instead is brought to life by science and then finds itself struggling with the concept of humanity and what is human and what is life. These are really strong themes that will project forward into science fiction that are really absent in these earlier speculative fictions. So you go, Mary Shelley. You are one hell of a chick inventing a whole huge genre. Now, much of the 19th century, this new genre pretty much lies dormant until a couple of dudes get a hold of it. One of them is H.G. Wells, who writes things like The War of the Worlds. And the other one is a Frenchman, Jules Verne, who writes things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, H.G. Wells is very interested in, he has time travel, he has alien invasion. These things will become major tropes throughout science fiction. Jules Verne is more interested in like really fantastic technology, submarine technology, you know, an ability to go to the moon, these sorts of things, like really technological. And this combo of both fantastical ideas like aliens and time travel and future things and hard science are what come together to really create what becomes very much science fiction of the 20th century. In the post-World War I period, science fiction becomes very popular among people, especially people who were interested in science to begin with, because what you have is rapid technological change. If you think about the difference in technology from the late Victorian era up until World War II, I mean, seriously, whoa, mind-blowing. And because of this, the idea and trust in science taking us somewhere good is explored through science fiction and is really highlighted in science fiction, this progressive idea. Because post-World War II, that starts to change because, well, the bomb and where rational science had started to lead us into some really nasty, murky places. After the war is really the golden age of science fiction. This is when you get writers like Ray Bradbury, where you get writers like Isaac Asimov, people who absolutely define hard science fiction for, they really solidify it and they take it from just this really pulpy genre, which is what it was before the war, in the interwar period, and really make it a very respectable genre in its own right. You also have Hollywood in this period. A little bit later, you have Hollywood as technology enables Hollywood to depict the things that had previously been only able to be shown in books. You start getting Hollywood bringing science fiction from like a B film to major blockbuster films. You also see a lot of really progressive ideas in science fiction still. You see a show like Star Trek that is written by mostly the really serious science fiction writers of the day, which is part of the reason why the early episodes seem to have no coherent quality, because they've got numerous different writers, but it encounters progressive political ideas, part of the whole thing with the skimpy costumes, and frankly, Captain Kirk should have died of space syphilis by the end of the 5-year mission that only went for 3 years because it got cancelled. Man, bummer. But the sex was designed to distract people so that they didn't notice the political and object to that. So you do a whole bait and switch, get them outraged by the sex, and then slip the political in underneath while they're being outraged by the sex, because people who get outraged by things can't do it in like too many things at once. They're very narrow focus, so it was really clever there. We'll get back to them again at some point. But this is also the period where you see the development of science fantasy. Now, a great deal of what we think of science fiction today is actually science fantasy. Science fantasy is where the focus comes off the science and off those sorts of concerns and onto the fantastical elements of it. So it's more aliens, it's more space battles, it's Star Wars. But there are numerous different things that fit under science fantasy that don't work in science fiction. So whereas something like The Fly is science fiction, something like Star Wars is science fantasy. So it's a blurring, science fantasy is a blurring of those two genres of science fiction and fantasy. And it takes fantasy elements and puts them into space or puts them into the future, and thus creates this weird amalgam of the two. Things that are pure science fiction are things like, do androids dream of an electronic sheep? There are a load of different hard science fiction that examine ideas that are current. And this is one of the limitations of science fiction. Science fiction has a tendency to date badly. It dates really badly because the future always turns up ahead. So we are currently living post 1984. We are currently living post the rise of the machines. But we always have new concerns that we want to examine. Ultimately, science fiction is about our present. So when we're talking about anything science fiction, it gives a window into the anxieties and the thoughts of the people who were writing it, rather than looking at it as predictions for the future. So we're going to be talking about some writers in the future that I have planned for you guys who do work in science fiction, but are not strictly speaking science fiction writers. But in order to understand their work, it's best to have a bit of an understanding of what science fiction is. So science fiction is very technologically based. It's asking questions about why or what does this do to us as human beings once we do this? Things that groovy chick, Mary Shelley, was already asking way back when. We're still asking the same questions. And so last time I spoke to you, we talked about Jeanette Winterson, who had written at least one science fiction novel in The Stone Gods, and also Frank Kirstein, which I didn't like terribly much, but it was playing with Frankenstein, and it was also playing with cybernetics and AI. So if that's like what you're into, great, but I'm really not a huge science fiction person. It's actually not my big go-to genre. So we will be talking about it, but sort of obliquely and at things because they've survived, that is one of the biggest things. It is genre fiction, and genre fiction has huge churn. It goes through so much, and it's disposable. Much of it is disposable, therefore it's very of its time. So we will encounter it, but not as a discrete genre, more as the way that writers have looked at science fiction and the way different places they've taken it. So I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace and love.
If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books, writing courses and other materials to help with your writing.